every person born into this world is raised within a culture that is going to be forced to take some things as axiomatic. And by that I mean there are going to be certain truth claims that you don't even start with questioning as if, is this true or not? You just take it at face value as true. Um, an easy one would be the existence of the physical world that you can see, taste, touch, smell. Um, it's only when you start getting into maybe, I don't know, maybe your teens, maybe it depends on the person. Some people never question these things, some people do. Um, but you could start to question things like, how do I know that the physical world around me is real? Maybe I'm a Hindu, and I don't believe that the physical world is anything more than an illusion. Maybe I'm Gnostic and believe that um, it's a lesser, base evil thing, and the spiritual realm is what's ultimately real, and the physical realm is, kind of of a barrier. There's lots of things that people treat as axioms. Um, the one that I want to talk on in relation to the patriarchy for this podcast I'm trying to launch has to do specifically with male sexuality. Now, what do I mean? What do I mean by that in terms of an axiom? I don't know if everybody who's watching this or listening to this is going to be able to relate um, specifically with my experience and my upbringing, but I have a feeling a lot of you might be able to. I don't think I'm alone in this. And so, let me plug my computer in so it doesn't lose charge here. So, what do I mean by male sexuality and an axiom? Um, as far as I can tell from my upbringing and from specifically the way that my parents raised me and the communities we were in, religious or otherwise, the notion that men and women, I don't want to say my parents taught me that we were identical. Okay, they would never have said that. But there were ways in which maybe expectations that were put upon the men, the boys, that kind of betrayed some egalitarian thinking. Maybe that'd be the best way to put it. The sense of expecting the same thing from a boy as you would from a girl. I mean, these are the classic examples would be putting boys and girls in a classroom like a public school, and wondering why all the boys are restless and kicking their feet and don't want to sit down, but all the girls tend to be fine sitting down for hours on end. What's wrong with the boys? They all have ADHD. No, they don't. That would be an example. Now, I was never in public school, but I still showed those same characteristics. I had a ton of energy as a kid. I didn't want to sit still and do a bunch of homework. I never enjoyed doing a bunch of homework unless it was on a subject that I was just particularly interested in. But when I talk about my male sexuality, I'm not just talking about desire for sex or sexual fetishes or things. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the core of what makes a man and a woman not a man, but something different. When we look at where does if we wanted to look at the history of where this egalitarian thinking came from, you may think that this, if you've never thought about it before, you may think that this is the way it's always been, or that at least this is the way it's always been in the West, or maybe the way it should be. But if you look at history, just the flow of history, this is more of a new idea. This is not something that has been historical. There's a reason why the patriarchy is a topic that's being brought up, because now people are starting to realize that there are, bitchy feminists that have been trying to destroy the patriarchy, and they view it as oppressive. And there's like I didn't start hearing this stuff until I was in my 20s about the patriarchy. I was like, what is the patriarchy? And I had heard of things like the patriarchs, in you're in the biblical text, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that they're we call them the patriarchs. So it's like, what do you mean down with the patriarchy? How the patriarchy is oppressive, has been oppressing women, and just that whole feminist narrative. Excuse me. So then I started delving into more of like, what is feminism, and looking into that, and then starting to see, the more that I studied and looked into this, just how much my upbringing and the culture at large has just been inculcated with feminist thinking. It got to a point where I basically started viewing American Christianity as just another bastion of feminism, and they largely are. The average institutional church group backs feminism. It's an axiom. Again, it's something that is taken for granted. There are verses in the Bible that are appealed to, that have nothing to do with the feminist mantras, but are still used as proof texts to support them, to try and say that men and women are equal. They'll appeal to a verse that says, it's basically making a point saying, ontologically, having to do with your value as a human being and your status before God. It'll say, everyone's equal. There's no, you don't have a greater capacity to, or maybe you don't have an advantage in terms of your access to God based on your gender. So, a man doesn't have easier access to God than a woman does. Men and women are both equal in that sense. A slave versus a free person, you're both equal. You both have equal access to God. But obviously there's differences within the physical realm, within the world in which we exist, and we have different impacts on the world. But it doesn't matter that, if you try and point that out to somebody who's got a feminist slant, whether they call themselves Christian or not, they're going to still harp on that and try and push that proof text and use eisegesis, in reading into it, or just twisting it. They're twisting the meaning of it, which is satanic by definition. So, I started noticing stuff like this and going, well, wait a minute, where are these axioms coming from? Because I thought they were Christian. I thought these were stuff from the biblical literature. Now, there are other ones too. There are other little things. Again, I didn't notice all this at once, and it wasn't even necessarily that I went looking for it. It's just that I started noticing discrepancies. Here's another one. The term adultery was something that kind of led me in this direction. And you may think, like, what does that have to do with the patriarchy and axioms and male sexuality, and what the heck does that have to do with anything there? Well, here's where it connects. Because the way that adultery had always been defined within my Christian circles, which is where I heard it defined, and I heard it preached from pastors in the pulpit, at a church setting, a church institutional Sunday morning church service. I'd hear, I don't know how many times, it was just, again, I took it as, that's the definition. I didn't think to question it. And the definition would be, if you are, whether you're a man or a woman, if you're married, to your spouse, and if you have sex with someone other than your spouse, so someone who's outside that marriage, then that is adultery. So if the man has sex with a woman outside of his marriage, to his wife, then he has committed adultery against his wife. He's been unfaithful, that'd be the definition. And then if a woman did the same, if she had sex with someone outside of her marriage to her husband, so anyone other than her husband, then she has committed adultery. And also the person who is, so the man with the woman outside of the marriage, that they're both committing adultery. And then the woman in the marriage with a man outside the marriage, they're both committing adultery. So there's two people committing adultery in both of those cases. So that's a very egalitarian view. It's adultery whether the husband does it or the wife does it. If you step outside the marriage and have sex with someone, by definition, it's adultery. Now that sounds pretty straightforward. If you've never questioned this before, then maybe you should, because the problem I came to is I was like, wait a minute. If that's correct, then how is it possible in the Old Testament specifically for men to have multiple wives? Like, I think Moses had 2 wives. I could be wrong. I'd have to double check. But I think even Moses did, the one who gave the law. The law of Moses. God used him to give the law, and the covenants and everything or the covenant, to the Hebrews, after they were taken out of Egypt. And in that law, it says, don't commit adultery. But then you have, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob, the classic, has 2 sisters as his wives. And I remember thinking, I was like, how could he do that, and that not be adultery? Because adultery means you step outside of, you make a covenant with with a woman, a marriage covenant. Well, then how could you get married to another woman and it not be adultery? Because I thought the definition of adultery is if you have sex with anybody outside of that first marriage covenant that you've made. And so then I thought, well, wait a minute. There's no indication in any of these cases in the Old Testament where it mentions multiple wives, because again, he just had 2 there, but he actually had 4. Maybe 2 of them were concubines. But in other words, he's having sexual relations with 4 different women, which produce the 12 tribes of Israel. So the question becomes, how is that possible without there being adultery? Is he in a state of perpetual adultery with his wives? If that's the case, the biblical text says nothing about that. So then that made me go, wait a minute. I don't think I understand I don't think I have the right definition of adultery. In other words, the axiom, this thing I didn't, that I took for granted as a truth claim, didn't think to question, turned out to be incorrect. So then when I looked into it, and I looked into, there's no, as far as I can tell, as far as I know, you can't find somewhere in the biblical text a place where it says adultery is this. It's not a dictionary. That said, you can look at every single case where adultery is referenced, and it always has the same pattern. The same thing is happening. So, for example, a classic case of adultery in the Old Testament is King David with Bathsheba. Now, King David, if you read, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, if you read the relevant literature on King David's life, from a shepherd boy all the way up to king, you see that he had multiple wives. He had multiple wives, and then he gets to a point where he doesn't go off to war. He stays behind. It doesn't tell the reason why. It just states that it's the springtime when kings go off to war, but David stays behind. Maybe for good reasons, maybe for bad. Text doesn't specify. And then he's up on his roof, and he, at night, and he looks down and he sees the wife of another man. And interestingly enough, just as a fun little side note, the man who's married to this woman, Bathsheba, that he sees, this wasn't just some random dude. This was literally a guy that was in the list. It's in a list, I think it's in 1st Chronicles. It's somewhere. But there's a list that has David's mighty men. These were men of renown that fought under King David. One of those was Uriah the Hittite. There's even importance there because he's not even an Israelite. I mean, he is in the sense that, he joined Israel. He converted, as it were. But he was originally a Hittite, and he's referred to as Uriah the Hittite. I think maybe part of the reason why they reference him that way is just to kind of emphasize, look, this guy had more loyalty and more honor than the king of Israel at this time. But anyway, King David sleeps with Bathsheba while Uriah is out fighting in war. And then Bathsheba lets David know, hey, you got me pregnant. And so then David tries to get Uriah to come back from the front lines, or from the war, and kind of like, hey, you're doing good. Give me an update. What's going on? Okay, now go ahead and go home and sleep with your wife. He's trying to cover up what he did wrong. So that doesn't work. Uriah's like, I'm not going to go and do that. All of my men are out there fighting. How could I do this? And so then King David plans to have Uriah killed, and so he uses military strategies to try and get Uriah to put on the front lines in an attack. When all of the men pull back, then he can get killed by the Ammonites, I think is who they were. But anyway, they're enemies that they were fighting. And so he does all of that, and it's pretty clever. Uriah dies, and then David takes Bathsheba as his wife. So then the prophet Nathan comes to David and says, basically tells him a little bit of a story, but essentially says, David, you took a woman that was not yours to take. This woman was someone else's man. This woman was owned by another man, was not yours. And in spite of the fact, in spite of the fact that he slept with her before he tried to kill Uriah. So he committed adultery, and then he committed murder. And the way that the text speaks of it is, even after the fact, there's still a reference to Bathsheba being the wife of Uriah, even though David eventually legally married her. But Nathan, I'm getting off into the weeds here. Nathan confronts David and says, you've committed adultery and you've committed murder. This woman was not yours. You stole her. And then there's a judgment that's connected with that. And also, Nathan does say, speaking for God, on God's behalf here, God's using Nathan the prophet to speak. Nathan essentially says, again, speaking for God, so God is saying, David, did I not give you multiple wives and many other things? And would I not have given you more? But because, in other words, I would have given you more, but because you took this woman that was not yours to take, in other words, you committed adultery. Because of that, here's a judgment that's going to follow. There will be strife. There will be a sword in your household. There's going to be drama for the rest of your lifetime, which is what happened. He had a lot of trouble with some of his sons, and the sword did not depart from his house. So, what do we see from that? Well, we see that God himself, speaking through the prophet Nathan, referred to the multiple women that David was, his multiple sex partners, as his wives. In other words, he was legally able to marry multiple women. Those weren't adulterous. God didn't call him out for adultery with those situations. He called him out for adultery with Bathsheba. Why? Why is it not adultery? Did he not step outside of his first marriage to sleep with other women? Because, again, according to that, the pastors that have gotten up from the pulpit and defined adultery that way, this would be, by definition, adultery. But that's not the right definition. The only time that David committed adultery from the biblical text is when he took Bathsheba. So, I realized I had to redefine the term. I couldn't take this definition that I had been given. And what it boiled down to, when I researched it out, was I realized the key ingredient. So in other words, if there's a crime that's been committed, a sexual crime, let's say, and you want to know, is this adultery? Is the crime that was committed adultery, or is it some other crime? Let's just make it a given that it's a crime. So there's some kind of a sexual crime that went on. What is that crime? Is it adultery? The only thing you have to know in order to be able to decide whether or not it's adultery is was there a married woman involved? So that's the first question. If the answer is yes, the next question is, did she have sex with someone other than her husband? Period. If the answer is yes, then adultery has occurred. If the answer is no, then adultery has not occurred. So what does that mean? That means, first and foremost, the definition that I gave at the beginning for adultery is you got a man and a woman in a relationship, they're married. If the woman steps outside of the marriage and sleeps with another man, well, she's a married woman. So she does that, that's adultery. Okay, she's an adulteress, and the guy who's sleeping with her, whether he's married or not, doesn't matter, he's committing adultery because he's sleeping with another man's woman. Okay? However, if a man steps outside of the marriage and sleeps with another woman, could be a sexual sin. We don't know. We don't know if it's adultery unless we ask the question, does it involve a married woman? Okay, it doesn't involve his woman. His woman's over here. She's not sleeping with anybody. There's no sex going on with her. We're talking about this guy, the married man. Did he commit adultery by sleeping with another woman? Again, you may be tempted to say, well, yes, of course, but no. Because again, what if the context is he married a second wife and now he's sleeping with her? Is that adultery? Biblically, it's not, because it's a legal, lawful marriage in the eyes of God. That's what David did. He took multiple wives. Okay, but what about if it's not someone he's taken as wife? He's just sleeping with a woman. Well, is that woman married? Is she like Bathsheba? Well, in that case, it's adultery because that's another man's woman. So now he's an adulterer and she's an adulteress, just like King David and Bathsheba. Okay, what if it's not a married woman? What if it's just a single woman? She's hot, he sleeps with her, it's a one-night stand. Is that adultery? The answer again is no, it's not. Now, is it a sexual sin? Sure, but it's not adultery. We could call it fornication, which is a more general term. It's something else. Now, in the Old Testament, if something like that happened within the law of Moses, if it is found out, if the community, the culture discovers this, and if the father of that woman permits it, essentially if the father finds out, hey, you, sir, just slept with my daughter, well, guess what? You're going to have to marry her. Because if you sleep with my daughter, if you have sex with her, you're essentially saying, I'm taking the responsibility of being a husband to her. You can't just sleep around in this culture. Law of Moses says you have to marry her, as long as I don't veto it as the father. You have to marry her, and you aren't allowed to divorce her for the rest of your life. That was the law of Moses. You can go check it out. It's in like Deuteronomy, where it describes this. Adultery, by the way, has the death penalty for both the adulteress and the adulterer, the male and the female. They're both supposed to be put to death. Now, King David received mercy. Just because you get the death penalty, or just because a crime merits the death penalty, doesn't mean that mercy can't be granted. David didn't get off, like he deserved to die, but God did give him mercy in that case. There were still consequences, though. But the point is, it's interesting to see the distinction in the Old Testament between something that's adultery, which bears the death penalty, and fornication, sleeping around, promiscuity, let's say, which doesn't require the death penalty. It just requires that, hey, you've got to marry her unless the father says otherwise. If the father vetoes it, he has the final say because he's the patriarch of the family. He is the head of his family. He gets a say over what happens with his daughter. So, and the whole idea of you can't get divorced is just so that I'll marry her and then I'll divorce her. We'll do that the next night. That kind of protects from just the promiscuity. But it's interesting that it doesn't bear the death penalty. I think that's fair. I think that's a missed point. People don't really notice that. Okay, so what's my point with all of that? My point is this egalitarian idea is not in the biblical text. Now, I've heard people say, well, yes, it's not in the Old Testament, but when you get to the New Testament with Jesus, Jesus essentially, what their argument basically becomes is he redefined adultery so that it is that, because nowadays, according to the New Covenant, the New Testament, what all of Western culture is based off of is one man, one woman, and anything other than that is sinful. And there's arguments like, God permitted divorce in the Old Testament, but he hated it. He states that. He also, and he permitted because of the hardness of their hearts. But God's view of multiple wives is the same. He permitted it because the culture allowed for it, but he hated it. It was actually sinful, but he permitted it. Just like divorce is sinful, but he permitted it. Like that's an interesting argument. It's kind of a funny argument because the Bible never says that. It says that about divorce. It says nothing about, multiple spouses, multiple wives specifically, being evil or wrong, or, that it's the result of a perverted sex drive of the man, or, Now, there were laws against hoarding up wives. It was specifically toward the kings, saying, don't hoard up wives. But hoarding up wives doesn't just mean having two wives. Like, I think the hoarding up wives, a classic example of that, especially for a king, would be King Solomon, who had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Concubines were just like a lesser status of wife. Sometimes they're referred to as wives, sometimes they're referred to as concubines. It was a little bit of a different legal agreement. I haven't delved into all of the differences, but think of it as like a lower status wife. But still a wife, still somebody that you owed your conjugal rights to. The husband had to provide provision and sex, and children and things like that for even his concubines. So you have Solomon with 1,000. I think he hoarded up wives, and it mentions that as a specific thing that kind of pushed him away from God, because he did it. He married a lot of foreign women who didn't follow Yahweh. They didn't follow the God that Solomon followed. And so they kind of drew his heart after other gods, and that wasn't good. So again, how is this? Let me tie this back in. Adultery, digging into that and seeing what the definition was, and seeing how I had been given a false definition. And let me touch on another argument. People will reference the passage in the New Testament where Jesus says, if any man looks at a woman with lust, looks at a woman to lust after her, he has committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that. And then they say, you can't lust after a woman, it's committing adultery. So it ends up basically being like, if you look at a woman, you find her sexually appealing, and maybe you're tempted to have sex with her or to do something in a sexual way with her. You're just feeling a draw in that way. It's arousing you. You've committed adultery. It's like that. That's wrong on tons of different levels. That people have made the argument. Pastors have been, look, Jesus took it a level up. He leveled it up. He raised the bar. He actually didn't raise the bar. If you look at the context, right before that, he says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder. But I say to you that if you look at a brother, if you harbor hatred in your heart for a brother, then you are essentially committing murder of the heart. I'm paraphrasing, but he is like, you don't accidentally murder someone. You can accidentally kill someone, but that's manslaughter. And the Old Testament had a distinction between that. Murder, though, is something you premeditate. It is sinful intrinsically. Manslaughter isn't sinful. It could be a tragedy, but accidentally killing someone. You're both working. Let's say you're both working on a building or something like that, and you drop a heavy object and it falls down and it hits one of your coworkers and he dies. Well, you didn't murder him, but you did slaughter him. It is manslaughter, and there are consequences for that, but it didn't bear the death penalty as far as I know, as far as I remember. but that's a tragedy. Murder, though, is something you premeditate. It's something that comes from a bad desire, a corrupt desire within you. That's what Jesus was saying. Like, look, if you're harboring hatred for your brother, like where you're like, I want him dead. If I could murder him, I would. He's like, that's a problem. God sees that. That's where the murder starts before the action comes. God's looking at your heart. He's not just looking at like, okay, you have a murderous heart, but you just haven't found a way to get away with it, so you're good. Okay, that's not what the law's purpose was. The law wasn't just merely to restrain evil action. It was for that, but it was supposed to be corrective. It was supposed to correct and to instruct, a person so that their heart would become better, more pure. So then he says that, and he goes, then you've also heard it said you should not commit adultery. Again, what's adultery? It's sleeping with a married woman that's not yours. Okay, it's a married woman sleeping with any other man, or it's a man sleeping with a married woman that's not hers. So in order to commit adultery, there has to be a married woman involved. Okay, when Jesus says, he who looks at a woman to lust after her, the word woman in the Koine Greek, okay, the text, it's in Koine Greek and it's translated into English. The translators can translate the word as woman or wife, because that word in Greek, so the Koine Greek didn't have two words, one wife and one woman. They just had one word for that. So if you're trying to refer to a man's wife, they didn't have another word for that. They just said a man's woman. And you would have to understand from the context that it's a man's woman. Oh, he owns that one. That one's his. We kind of do that nowadays. You could say that, that's my woman, don't mess with her. Oh, no, that's my woman right over there. That's my wife. It's understood from the context. So Jesus, the point is, Jesus is referring to married women when he says that. It's blatantly obvious if you understand what adultery is. And he's speaking to people who are under the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. He's speaking to them who know the law. He's not giving a new definition here. He doesn't say, hey, I've got a new definition. He's saying, look, if you're looking at another married woman, a woman that's not yours, in order to lust after her, to desire her, which is kind of like to covet. Again, the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments say, don't covet your neighbor's wife, don't covet your neighbor's donkey, don't covet anything that's your neighbor's. Okay, how do I know if somebody's coveting my stuff? That's kind of hard to, like if somebody's coveting my cell phone, but he doesn't do anything about it, like I can't really, I can't charge him for that, under the, like, how would I prove that? Go to the judges and be like, hey, my neighbor is coveting my cell phone. Oh, really? How do you know? Well, I can just tell. It's like, well, okay, has he taken did he steal it? Oh, he didn't steal it. Okay, well, that's one of the laws, thou shalt not steal. If he steals it, well, then obviously he was coveting it beforehand. So it's interesting. The coveting is a little bit harder to, like, I feel like that would be like, there'd be like two charges against him. Okay, you coveted your neighbor's cell phone and you stole it. So we're getting you on two counts here. You did these two things. You coveted your neighbor's wife and you committed adultery with her. Death penalty, and then some or whatever. But that's essentially what Jesus is pointing out. He's saying, look, if you're looking at another man's wife and you're coveting her, you're looking at her not just as in, oh, I see her, but to lust after her, to desire her for yourself sexually, you're committing adultery with her in your heart, because you may not have the opportunity to do it in the flesh, to do it in real life. But you could do it in your mind. You could desire it. You could be like, if I could get away with this, I would do it. That's what Jesus is calling out, which is, that's a quite the accusation to launch in public to his hearers, his listeners. So that's what he's doing. He's not raising the bar to some other definition that we just want to throw in because of our feminist modernity that we have. That's not what he's saying. So anybody who tries to argue otherwise and people get into even bizarre stuff and say that, like, they'll misapply that, misdefine it, and then say even lusting after your own wife because, well, your wife is a woman, and so if you're looking at your own wife and lusting after her, then you're committing adultery. You can commit adultery against your own wife in your heart. I mean, this is bizarre. That's not what the text is saying. So when I start to notice all of these things, and there's many other things I've noticed, but I started to realize, okay, there's something else going on under the surface, and it's a complete and fundamental misunderstanding of male sexuality. And then I realized, oh, this isn't an accident. Okay, I'm stuck at a tail end of a century more of definitely more of philosophical movements and thinking and thought processes and spiritualism that has resulted in a bastardized, it's probably even worse than that. It's just a false definition of what it is to be a man, what male sexuality is, what a male sex drive is. And it's difficult. I do want to give a little bit of grace to people who wrestle with it, because I've wrestled with this too, because I'm talking specifically from like the Christian crowd, the people that believe there's actually something wrong with humanity, that we're not perfect or born with a blank slate, as it were, that there are issues that we have. Because if you view humanity as being born in a corrupted form to some degree, well, then the question is, to what extent are we corrupt? It's the idea of being born fallen. The fall. Adam and Eve fell. They fell from their position, their status, their perfection, because of their disobedience to God. And because of whatever occurred there, the rest of humanity, being their descendants of Adam and Eve, have a fallen state that we've inherited. And that gets into a lot of theological stuff that I don't really want to delve into at this point in time. But I'll touch on it like this. We don't have to get too deep into that. If you have parents who are drug addicts, and specifically your mother is a drug addict taking cocaine in large amounts while you're in the womb, that's going to have an impact on you. Okay, so you're going to be born with maybe a little bit more issues than you would have been if it hadn't have been for the actions of your mother while you were in the womb. We do get DNA from our parents, and that DNA could be corrupted. And if their actions caused even further corruption, further abuse, to our physical body and mental faculties and everything, that's not strange. That's just the way it is. That's the way the world is. So there is an impact that your parents can have on who you are as a person and the things you wrestle with. Maybe you have a proclivity towards certain addictions that other people don't, and it's because of the genetics, your family line. It could be the culture that you're born into and the proclivities of that culture towards certain sinful behaviors, or bad things in general. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how twisted is your sexuality? How do I define, where do I draw the line on what is a healthy sexuality, a healthy sex drive, and a corrupt sexuality or a corrupt sex drive for male or female? Where do I draw those lines? And it's difficult, maybe even more so nowadays, just with the ubiquitousness of just how ubiquitous your pornography is, in all of its forms. I'm not just talking about visual internet pornography, the kind that most people think about when you say the term pornography. I'm talking about smut. I'm talking about romance novels, movies. Was it like Letter to John, Twilight, the Twilight Saga, any rom-com, 50 Shades of Grey, like all of this stuff is porn. And again, even what is porn? How do we define that? What's the difference between erotic literature versus pornography? And so all of this stuff is stuff that's just not. It's very vague and muddled, and nobody knows where to draw the lines. So it's tough. And to throw another wrench into the system, if you're coming from a Christian background that's specifically Calvinistic, now some of you have no clue what I'm talking about when I say this. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, for better or for worse. Maybe you consider yourself a Calvinist. I do not. I'm staunchly anti-Calvinist in many ways. I think it's Gnostic heresy. Again, you may not know what that means either. But for those who don't know, Calvinism has this idea that has a lot of ideas that I disagree with. One is that you're born into the world totally depraved, and different Calvinists who have studied out their Calvinism, again, this all comes from a guy named John Calvin. Teachings that he taught. He was a reformer. He broke away from the Catholic Church back when the Protestant Reformation was occurring, Martin Luther and all of them. John Calvin wrote his Institutes, which I have not read. I've heard of them here and there, but in other words, he had teachings that later were then formulated, kind of put together by a lot of his followers, and were kind of collectively called as Calvinism, Calvinistic beliefs, beliefs and philosophical perspectives on the Bible and theology that kind of came from John Calvin and his thinking. And John Calvin got his thinking from other people like Augustine. So anyway, the point is, he has some ideas. One of those ideas is that humanity, every human being, is born totally depraved. That's a Calvinist idea. It's like, what does that mean? Some people might take more of a lighter definition and say that means that there's no part of the human being that is perfect. So you could say my physical body is imperfect. That's why it's going to die. But my mental, my mind is still pristine. It's perfect. It's not affected by the fall. That would be that would not be totally depraved, according to some definitions. In other words, not every aspect of your being is suffering from corruption. So some people would just say total depravity means that every aspect of your being has suffered some corruption. That might be one way to think of it. Now, I believe that. That's actually my stance, but I don't believe the Calvinistic doctrine, because from what I understand and from what consistent Calvinists, people who actually know what they're talking about when they say they're a Calvinist, their view is not just that it's every aspect of your being that's corrupt, but that you're at the lowest status of corruption there could be. You could be mildly corrupt, or you could be totally depraved. The problem with that is it doesn't stand up to Scripture, because you see evidences, like in Romans 1, a letter that Paul wrote, of Paul saying basically this is what a society looks like as it slowly goes further and further and slips further and further into more and more depravity. It's so there's levels of depravity. So in that case, you're not born totally depraved. You can sink into further depravity. And that's just, if you look at your life as you go through life, that's just true. You can test that part out. So I reject total depravity. But let's say I didn't. Let's say that I believed that I was born into this world and I'm completely and so totally depraved. I'm hopelessly totally depraved. I don't even realize how totally depraved I am. If I take that as an axiom, well, then what do I do if I look at my sex drive? I have to immediately go, well, it's totally depraved. And that fits very well with the idea that if I just look at a woman with lust, I've sinned because I'm just so totally sexually depraved. It fits well with that kind of thinking, unfortunately, and so it just makes it worse. So now you've got, there's purity culture and all these other kinds of things within Christian circles about you have to guard a woman's heart and you can't flirt, and you just, it's almost like it basically got to a point where I realized when I started thinking about it, I was like, I feel like I've spent most of my teen years on into my 20s and even into my 30s, but definitely teens and 20s, trying to make myself as unattractive as possible so that I wouldn't be violating any rules, let's say, that were supposed to govern. Like if a woman is even the slightest bit turned on by me and my presence or something I do, it's like, ooh, that's bad, because now I'm making her lust. She's lusting after me, and I feel like she's, I don't know what it's like on the girls' side of things. They probably have the same types of issues, but it's like, it's almost, you come to a point where you think any kind of sexual attraction is by definition evil. And so that's a problem, because that's not true. It's really stupid to be pushing an ideology, because that's what it is, that makes sexual attraction by definition evil, because that's literally part of the bridge between finding, like how do you find what are you supposed to do? What does that logically lead to? That leads to, well, I've got to pick somebody. I've got to pick a wife, pick a woman that I'm not attracted to sexually, that does nothing for me, doesn't push my buttons at all. That's the ideal woman for me, because if I find someone that does push my buttons, well, now I'm going to be tempted to lust after her, and then it's adultery. And so then it's like, then you end up shaming men and women for their sex drives and for being attracted to the opposite sex. And it's just a mess. It's so frustrating to think that that's the mindset that I was born into. So I think we'll pause there, and I'm going to pick up and continue this. This will be part 1. So thank you for listening.